Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Tom Chaney and this is Living Health Live. Joining me on the show as well as in my life and in our practice, Living Health Integrative Medicine, is my wife, Dr. Steph Chaney. We are your trusted source for the latest information to help you get and stay healthy naturally. We're super excited to be joining you regularly to take you on an adventure of a lifetime. This is your lifetime of great health. You're going to get information, strategies, and some of the latest research on how to live a better and healthier life. So the information shared on today's podcast is for information only. It's not intended to replace any substitute for medical treatment. So today's topic, what we want to talk about today is we're going to get into testing, and we're going to talk about routine conventional testing. This is what most patients come into our practice and they bring us. So we see patients that they've already been to other doctors. Most of the time, we're not the first providers that we're seeing, that the patient is seeing. So they're going to bring us all their lab work, and we review this lab work on a routine basis. So we're going to talk about what we typically see, and then we're going to compare that to the Living Health comprehensive testing that we do in a practice, and we'll talk about, how do we decide what we're going to test for with each patient. So let's first, Dr. Steph, let's get into the routine lab testing.
Okay, so routine lab testing, like primary care doctor kind of stuff, general annual workup, pretty limited. Pretty superficial, and oftentimes usually just kind of checking the stuff that most patients are being medicated for. So cholesterol, we like to medicate with statins for these things, right? So we're checking cholesterol levels, glucose, what a lot of diabetics, hemoglobin A1C may or may not be on that. If you're it's not usually done unless sugar starts showing up high and the person's diagnosed with diabetes. So a lot of pre-diabetes might be getting missed out there. Kidney function, liver function, these two are just kind of generally usually checked because most people who have diabetes or elevated cholesterol are on medications that can affect the function of these glands, these organs. And then red blood cell count and white blood cell count. And white blood cell count and red blood, these are usually totals. So oftentimes they're not even doing the differential, which is actually testing and calculating the ratios and percentages of the different types of white blood cells and the different red blood cell markers. So this is pretty much it. It's about a page and a half usually of blood work. And that's it. Oftentimes, the other thing too is that patients will go in and see their doctor, and then blood work's ordered. The patient gets blood work done, and then they're not seeing their doctor for another 3, 4, 6, 12 months, depending on how stable things are. They hear nothing about their blood work. They may have access to it in the portal, but no one's really reviewing it with them. Unless something, it's really crazy, like the sugars are all of a sudden super high compared to where they were, then they may get called back in for medication. So that's pretty much it. Generally, the blood work, more often than not, is not being run before the visit. So it's like visit, out for blood work, don't hear anything, running blind. That's essentially what's happening.
That's right. And I think a lot of patients, like included in those tests, like what is typically included is something called a CBC, right? Complete blood chemistry.
Right.
Right.
Well,
and that
they're usually getting a basic chemistry.
Yeah. Okay. So
they're not even getting a complete.
Yeah. And then maybe they're getting a CMP, right? Metabolic panel.
Yeah. Or usually a BMP. So basic metabolic panel.
Yep. Basic metabolic panel. All right.
So they're not getting complete.
So they're missing things.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay. And then how about thyroid? Is thyroid usually included?
If they might get TSH, usually most doctors are only going to run thyroid if they're already diagnosed or if they're experiencing fatigue, it's not usually run generally as a screening test for most people. So that's not often getting checked. And even if it is, it's just TSH, maybe T4, which is one of the thyroid hormones. There's about, 7 other markers that we usually run with thyroid. And if they're complaining of fatigue, which a lot of people are these days, iron usually is not run as a screening test. And generally, unfortunately, a lot of these tests are not covered as screening tests. So there has to be a complaint associated. But even then, most people aren't getting these markers run.
Right. And we haven't even talked about like vitamin levels, right? So like, for example, vitamin D, like what's the policy with Medicare on vitamin D?
So they don't cover it unless you're low.
So how do you know if you're low?
Correct. That's kind of the insanity of the system. Yeah. And now there's so much research shows the importance of optimized vitamin D levels. And yet in the insurance industry, they're even revamping whether or not, like what the levels are that are ideal and whether or not it should even be run and covered at all. But unfortunately, the crazy thing is when you think about the Medicare population is 65 and older, usually these are the patients that are more prone to diseases and illnesses and issues that are dramatically affected by vitamin D levels. So bone density, cancer, diabetes, dementia, brain stuff, all of these things need optimized vitamin D levels. And you can't run it as a screening test. You can only run it if it's already low. So
Crazy. Yeah.
Sometimes they're running B12. Sometimes,
maybe,
if the doctor's office does B12 shots, they might be checking B12. But then you get into the discussion of what, for example, the major labs like LabCorp and Quest, what their actual ranges even mean, because usually those aren't necessarily telling us anything clinically significant. They're just telling us an average of what the population is looking like.
Right. And so we can talk about that really quickly because the conventional provider, they get those lab results back from, like you said, Quest or from LabCorp. Mm-hmm. And then what they're looking at is they're looking at those ranges. So we look at those ranges, but we also look at something called functional ranges. So why don't you talk about what is a functional range?
Well, depending on the marker, the functional range is a low and high range that is ideal for optimal function. Not simply the minimum to not get an actual disease, right? It's either based on what's been supported in the literature, or clinically what is relevant. So, and then it depends on the marker, right? So we run a lot of inflammation markers, and we run inflammation markers with a lot of our biotoxin, chronic fatigue, mold, etc. patients. And I have seen the upper end of that range change from our original Dr. Shoemaker ranges, right? Every few years, they seem to go up and up and up and up. And on the lab, that can present looking normal. So, for example, if the range is, 300 to 2,300 for an inflammation marker, and then a few years later, that upper level goes to 4,800. And then a couple of years later, that goes to 6,600. And then right now, it's like, I'm thinking of one marker in particular, it's up to 22,000. And that's simply a bell curve average of what's going into the lab. And since more and more providers are running markers like this with their patient, and certainly we are running these markers quite often, most of the patients coming to see us, I'm ruling in or out things that require me to run these markers, and I'm not running them on healthy people. So LabCorp doesn't have like these acute inflammation markers run on the whole population. So the averages now are skewing higher and higher and higher, but that bell curve, it means they don't get flagged as high with the bell curve range for LabCorp. So it's there, the labs are not clinical interpretations. They're just simply averages.
Yeah, so I think that's really important to understand. There's something when you're thinking about disease, there's, the ranges, and you're outside of that lab range, you're probably in a disease state versus optimal function. That's a whole nother discussion. So we got to look at both of those.
Right. So like if the high end of, for example, this acute inflammation marker, if the high end is really like shouldn't be higher than 2,300, and the lab range sets it at the high end is at 20,000. Well, between 2,300 and 20,000, we have a problem.
Right.
Regardless of what the lab says. I don't care what the lab says. Just give me the hard number, right? But it can be somewhat confusing for doctors and patients. And the range could be set by some mandate based on some, you know what I mean? Like
right.
Most
of them are not
interest.
Standardized, right?
Yeah, like pharmaceutical interests. Like in the 80s, 300 was normal for cholesterol. Then the statins came on the market. Well, they increased the market. They dropped the range down to 2,500, and then the upper range went to 250, and then it went to 220, and now it's 200. And they don't care how low they get. So we've got patients coming in with a cholesterol level total of 110, and that's like great. Well, no, that is actually way too low.
Right.
So the lab doesn't set a low range because the pharmaceutical industry wants you to they want everybody on the statin medication. So there's a lot of conflict of interest, I think, with some of those ranges, and some of them are just not, there's just not enough, like there are not enough people doing them, running these certain tests, these specialty tests for the labs to even know. So they're just posting averages.
Right. I think the other thing I'll bring up as far as routine testing with conventional providers, what I see many times is the provider is just looking at that one test. So I've had patients, for example, diabetics that come in, and I look at their history of testing, and we can see that, over time, every time they've gone in, that number has been going up. It's in a normal range still, but it's gone up each time. So, and many times they're not, this isn't brought to their attention so that they can actually do something about it.
Right. Like take TSH, for example. So that's a thyroid stimulating hormone. That's the pituitary gland hormone that pushes the thyroid to produce more thyroid hormone. So the range is quite broad for LabCorp. It's 0.45 all the way up to 4.5. And so we can see it bumping up and down, which is sometimes an indication of autoimmune issues. We can see it slowly over time going up, up, up. But if it's in range, so if it's 0.6 and then eventually it's 0.9, then eventually it's 1.5, then eventually it's 2.5 and 3.5 and 4, that's all in normal. So the doctor never gets flagged, but we're watching it, and now you're getting functionally high. You've gone from functionally, like, what's going on? So that actually is a prompt for us to dig a little deeper to figure out what's happening, because we're trying to catch things before they turn into full-blown crises.
Right. Now, with that being said, you get your routine testing done, but I think you have to be on top of your doctor. You have to really be on top of your numbers. You have to know your numbers, and you have to be tracking. And you got to take responsibility for your own health and your own numbers in this current climate. So I emphasize that to all of our patients. Now, when it comes to our testing, so we have patients that have gone through, maybe they're not, a lot of patients are coming to us because they're not seeing results with their current care. Like I said before, we're typically not the first provider that most patients come and see. So we have a battery of tests that are available to us that most conventional providers are not even, it's not on their radar. They're not running it because, like Dr. Steph said, what they're looking to test for is something that they can actually prescribe a pill for. And, we have a pill that can lower cholesterol, right? So we run cholesterol. But when it comes to our testing, our comprehensive testing, one of our other podcasts, we talked about how we look at health, and we want to address root causes. And we talked about the core four. We talked about trauma. We talked about toxins. We talked about deficiencies. And we also talked about infections and infestation. So when it comes to most of the patients, and there's a bunch of subcategories underneath all of those, but those are the core four. And so when a patient comes in, we take a history. That's what we're thinking with. We're thinking with, okay, how do we actually test for these issues or possible issues to see if this could be causing dysfunction in this person's body?
Right. Like, we're not, like, if someone comes in and they've got diabetes or an autoimmune disease, like, we already know their sugars are high. Like, even if they're on medications, their sugars are probably still high. Right. So yeah, I mean, we're still going to test to see where are their sugars at.
The A1C
but like, the important stuff is like, well, okay, so what's causing it? So you go to the core four and you're like, so there's trauma, right? That can be emotional, chemical, physical trauma. But the three biggies that really we address are toxins, deficiencies, and infections or infestations. Those are the three big things aside from trauma that will be at the root of most people's chronic issues. So how do we test for that? Well, if we're testing for parasites and yeast and fungus and all that stuff, there's just take the white blood cell total count. That is not enough. I need to see all the different types of white blood cells and the percentage of each. What are the balance between neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils? If eosinophils, for example, it's a white blood cell that produces histamines, it's implicated with allergies. But if it's single digit high over 3%, so 4% or 5% of your white blood cells are eosinophils, that's an indicator for parasites. That's without me even like doing a stool test, right? And then we have specialty tests to determine, do you have parasites? Do you have yeast or fungus? We have specialized urine testing. We do something here called biomeridian assessment, where we're actually doing testing for the system to see if you have parasites, because they're not just in your large intestines. They could be anywhere. Multiple sclerosis has been proven to be microscopic threadworms in the central nervous system. You can have parasites in your liver, parasites in your pancreas. What if your diabetes is partially caused because of the inflammation and stress to the pancreas because of something like that? So there's specialized tests. There's more in-depth looking at blood work. And then there's also specialized tests like the urine test. So gut candida, gut inflammation. So we do urine tests. It's an organic acid test for like hundreds of different markers in the urine. Some of them are toxins that come out in the urine. Like if a person has mold or something, mold toxins can be tested. Environmental toxins, plastics, glyphosate, whatever, formaldehydes, right? Like people can be exposed. Heavy metals we test for with blood, hair, and urine. So what's coming out in the hair for mercury, what's in the urine coming out for mercury, the different types. There's different types and forms of mercury, and then other toxic metals, and then balance and ratios between different minerals. Yeah, I'm taking, copious amounts of some mineral every day, calcium. Well, it turns out your calcium's completely way too high compared to magnesium and zinc and others, So that's an important factor. So brain chemicals, the neurotransmitters, that balance, we can measure with questionnaires even, but also specialized urine testing. Hormones, we measure hormones in many different ways. And one of the most frustrating things for when I'm working with a female who's menstruating and she's had blood work done for hormones, I'm like, well, where in your cycle were you? Well, I don't remember. Well, a one-shot blood of estrogen, progesterone randomly in your cycle is going to tell us nothing.
Yeah. So most providers, or most of the tests that we see that providers are running when patients bring in their test results are just, like you said, the one-shot urine test.
Or one-shot blood test.
Okay. Yeah. Or blood test.
They're literally that's what they're getting. Gotcha. And Yeah. So we, for example, with a menstruating female, we might recommend a saliva test that runs actually several samples over the course of an entire menstrual cycle, so that we can actually see, like, how does estrogen come up? How does project, like, so we can figure out what's wrong with a person if that's the issue they're dealing with. Inflammation can be tested so many different ways. It can be tested through the urine testing that we do. We have blood inflammation markers that we look at, some like C-reactive protein, homocysteine, ferritin. These are metabolic inflammation markers that need to be looked at. And they can help direct supplementation, like what nutrients are we going to provide for someone that's very targeted for that particular person's issues. But also biotoxin markers, other white blood cell inflammation markers get looked at, again, for us to know what is contributing to their underlying issues, right? So vitamin and mineral deficiency, there's lots that we can get if we run comprehensive blood work just through the same lab that people go get their routine testing from. So LabCorp, whatever. When we are running, instead of just like 10 markers, we might be running, 30, 40, 50 different markers, not just running the actual like vitamin D levels, B12, but looking at other factors and patterns in the blood work that tell us that there's a need for or a deficiency of some type of nutrient, right? Like if homocysteine is high, regardless of what someone's MTHFR genetics trendy gene testing is, if homocysteine is elevated, they need higher amounts of methylated folic acid and B12. So that's going to help us direct that, right? When we run complete red blood cell markers and I look at all the red blood cell factors, including iron as well, I'm able to say, oh, this person actually has a folic acid anemia or B12 anemia or iron deficiency anemia. Those aren't being routinely looked at. So it almost doesn't matter what your B12 levels are in your blood. It really, and LabCorp's range for that is kind of crazy. We can do really comprehensive nutrient testing with micronutrient testing of actually what's in the blood cells themselves, and get a very comprehensive test done for vitamins, minerals, amino acids, and fatty acids and antioxidants in one, pretty in-depth panel. If we're trying to rule in or out a tremendous amount of deficiency issues. Mitochondrial dysfunction. So everybody talks about mitochondria and aging, and yes, you got to have healthy mitochondria to be healthy, period. Mitochondria are the part of every cell that makes energy. And the mitochondria, they're basically like the furnace, the fuel cell of the entire body. And they require oxygen, CoQ10, B vitamins, vitamin A, vitamin E, all these different things in order to spit out the one little energy molecule ATP for the cell, in order for the cell to run and for you not to age out and die. So we can actually, with our urine testing or organic urine testing, can determine what state of stress the mitochondria are in, and what type of, again, supplementation and nutrient do we need to focus on for that person. And by the way, we do the same lab testing that the regular doctor does. But that's all kind of part of it, right? So we might do saliva, we might do urine, we might do blood, hair, urine, we might do meridian testing, energy testing. There's lots of different types of testing that we do. And I like having a little bit of backup between 2 or 3 labs that are kind of verifying the priority for the patient. If I do meridian test and I'm finding that they're responding to parasite medications and antifungal medications or herbs, and their organic acid test shows byproducts of yeast and fungal overgrowth in the body confirmed, and their white blood cell counts show a pattern for parasites, all of that kind of works in when we look at their history, it's like, yeah, this person's got this. So this is our main issue.
So we get the testing completed, the test results will come back, and then we start analyzing all these tests for the patient. And then we start working up what's the best plan of action, what would be the best next step. Mm-hmm. And part of that is prioritizing, right? So you mentioned that. So like certain things have to be handled before others. And that's why I think a lot of patients that come see us, they get frustrated because things haven't been handled appropriately. And we're seeing more and more that patients have gone online and maybe they've done a blood test online. And then, unfortunately, these blood tests, a lot of them that are done online, they just spit out this, AI generated supplement list, right? And it's just saying, okay, take this supplement. But is that actually going to handle the root cause of the problem?
Right. Yes. And so, other providers sometimes are kind of dabbling in, running some specialty tests, or they'll run one panel of something that they think is going on, and that comes back, and then they say, okay, so this test is, so it just becomes this whole like process. And even as comprehensive as we are with testing, it can still take a while to get some of these tests back. And then for us, there still may be additional tests that's needed depending on how, they test out, but we will have insight into, whatever protocols that we feel we need to do, we'll be able to lay it out a little bit more comprehensively. And it's important to do comprehensive testing to determine, what can you really start a patient with? Like, how much do you think they can handle? Some people are coming in and they're so chronically ill that we have to just work on getting toxins out of the body before we start killing parasites, for example, because their body would just be so inflamed and jacked up if we just went on a big killing spree, and they're already so bogged down in toxins that they can't get out of their system. So there's like all these different factors that we have to look at when we're coming up. But the point is, if you're just getting like cholesterol, sugar, liver tested at your doctor's office, it's not telling you anything.
Right.
Other than a symptom.
Yeah. And it depends on your health goals. So if, a lot of patients, they come to us, they may have chronic conditions, but some of them just want to optimize their health, and they're looking as far as like longevity, and they want more in-depth testing. So that's what we provide. And I hope this helps you guys understand what you're getting, because not all blood tests are created equal. Every time you go into the lab, they're going to do a blood draw, but what matters is what has been ordered. And it may require that we dig deeper and run some of these unconventional tests to actually help you achieve your health goals. So you've been listening to Living Health Live. This is Dr. Tom Chaney with Dr. Stephanie Chaney. So you guys can reach us at our office at 410-216-9180. If you guys have any questions, you can also send your questions over to info@mylivinghealth.com. Our website is mylivinghealth.com. And hope you got some great information from today's webinar, and we'll see you guys on the next show.